If you've spent any amount of time researching into retirement, especially if you're a physician household, the 4% rule has probably popped up somewhere in that reading. And on the surface, it sounds fairly simple and straightforward. I can withdraw 4% of the value of my portfolio in perpetuity, and life is good. But in practice, the 4% rule for retirement is slightly a little more complex than that. And the reality is that retirement planning, just by its nature, at least in my opinion, warrants just a little more thought and planning than just a back of the napkin math of 4% of your portfolio, determining the success or failure of a 30-year plus retirement. I'm Scott Sturgeon. I'm a senior wealth advisor and founder of Oread Wealth Partners. We are a fee-only fiduciary financial planning and wealth management firm working with physicians and business owners as they plan for retirement, helping them to align their finances with what's important in their lives. And what we often find is important for those individuals is planning around retirement. So is the 4% rule something we can abide by in planning for retirement? And if the 4% rule is based on a 30-year retirement timeline, is it something we can also rely on for a longer time horizon for retirement? If I retire at 55 or 60, is it something that can sustain me for 30 to 40 to even 50 years of retirement planning over time? So before we dive too much into the weeds of can the 4% rule be sustainable for us in planning over retirement over long periods of time, let's answer the question of what actually is the 4% rule in planning for retirement. By way of background, the 4% rule was created in 1994 by an individual named Bill Bengen. The idea essentially was that looking back over all market data from 1926 through 1994 and looking at 30-year periods within that general period of time, specifically periods where the market was not doing very well. And if an individual is to retire in one of those 30-year periods in the worst possible market conditions, what amount, number one, could they withdraw from their portfolio in that first year as a percentage of the portfolio? And then for subsequent years, if they just made additional withdrawals, based on that original amount, adjusted for inflation over that 30-year period, what would be a sustainable withdrawal rate for that individual, again, in that pretty bad market time frame? The answer that Bill came to was around 4.15%, or again, the more catchier 4% rule, that an individual could retire with $1 million, withdraw 4% in that first year, $40,000, and then adjust that amount withdrawn each year based on whatever the recurring inflation amount might be for each year. So why did this 4% rule catch on so much? I mean, a few theories abound. In general, probably just because it's really catchy and it's fairly simple. I can withdraw 4% of my portfolio and then adjust those withdrawals for inflation over time. I'll have a successful retirement as a result. And I think additionally, it just gives people a concrete example of something to draw on. The previous example I just mentioned, $1 million, essentially sustaining a 4% withdrawal in that first year and then adjusting for inflation thereafter. It's fairly easy math. It's easy for people to calculate. And I think as you're kind of nearing retirement, it kind of gives a good kind of framework for those thinking, if I spend this amount each year, what size roughly of a portfolio would I need to sustain that withdrawal rate over time? The challenge or kind of the problems I think that arise though with believing or using the 4% rule just very simply without any other kind of additional consideration or analysis is just that retirement is a little more complex than just adhering to a single rule. And there is importantly just these ideas of the parameters of the study. It was done over a 30-year time period for a retiree. If you retire for 40 years, or 50 years even, suddenly the math starts to change a little bit. You might be subject to slightly more risk as it pertains to the market in general. And there's just a lot of additional other considerations that we'll get into that are very important as it pertains to just planning for retirement, above and beyond just what that 4% rule can provide us. So what are some of these additional considerations as it pertains to the 4% rule? I think first and foremost, a really important one, like I just mentioned, is that if you retire earlier, you're subject to a longer time horizon in retirement. If you retire at 50, for example, you could be planning for literally a 50-year retirement if you live to age 100, or 45 years at age 95. That extra 15 years probably doesn't sound like a lot above what the 4% rule study was done, but the reality is that's just more time for market crashes or changes in the market, periods of higher inflation, potential market volatility, and the biggest one probably of all of these is just sequence of returns risk, especially in those early years of retirement. And so for those variety of reasons, not to say the 4% rule is wrong per se, it's just that longer periods of time in retirement requires additional consideration. People live longer now than they did in 1994. And so the idea of planning around just a 30-year retirement, certainly while it's not a bad place to start, I think just again, with longer periods of time potentially in the mix for retirement warrants just some additional consideration. I just mentioned sequence of returns risk, and that's kind of that second consideration we really want to make sure that we're addressing in planning for retirement in general, and especially factoring in the 4% rule as well. Sequence of returns risk is essentially the idea that if you take two individuals who have the same average return over a 10-year period of time, the overall success or failure of their financial plan, and by extension their retirement plan, can vary pretty drastically based on when they experience different returns within that 10-year period of time. So again, average is the same, but let's say 5 of those years are horrible returns and 5 of those years are incredible returns. Well, if I'm the individual who experiences 5 years of terrible returns right at the start of retirement, that can then have a very large negative impact on the overall plan of my retirement over that 10-year time frame, as opposed to the individual who has 5 years of incredible returns, followed by 5 years of terrible returns, kind of the opposite of that. And so when we think about the 4% rule, essentially what we're thinking about as it pertains to sequence of returns risk is if I retire and then the very next day there is a significant market correction. Let's say you retire and then the very next year your portfolio is declined by half. Well, suddenly the calculation of 4% of that original portfolio value, making withdrawals from that account based on a significant decline in the balance of the account, can have an overall negative impact on the overall likelihood of success in making continued withdrawals from that portfolio over time. But again, the challenge is just that you want to make sure that you're covering and protecting yourself in planning for retirement over that long period of time, and that just a 4% rule, just a hardline rule, might not address some of those sequence of returns and the risks that can come from them, and especially if there are significant declines in the market earlier on in retirement. The third kind of issue that can come up with the 4% rule is that, especially for early retirees at 55 or 60, you are making withdrawals from a portfolio without kind of the benefit or buffer of Social Security or other pensions or fixed income amounts that you otherwise might have. If you have alternative income streams, fantastic. Maybe this isn't as relevant, but it's the idea of wanting to factor in this concept of, if I don't have Social Security payments as kind of a buffer against negative markets or things like that, and I'm making portfolio withdrawals for, again, that 10 to 15 year period, it's just an additional element I want to factor in. If I retire at 55 and I'm not going to start making Social Security withdrawals until 65 or 70, that's a long period of time to rely on portfolio withdrawals. And so, 4% would likely work or could be made to work. But I think it's just something that you want to factor in as we're kind of going along and making those kinds of decisions. The fourth consideration of incorporating the 4% rule into a retirement plan is just this idea of, if I'm retiring early, or just retirement in general, especially in those earlier years, it's very likely that you're going to have some of the highest spending years that you'll ever have in retirement within that first 10-year kind of decade time horizon of retirement in general. We see this time and time again, and there's studies that actually back this up, that when you're in your kind of most mobile years, you have the funds to travel, to do things that maybe you deferred or put off while you were in your working years or raising kids. People just spend more money. And that's not a bad thing per se, but it is important to kind of factor it in and say, maybe I need to have a 5 or 6% withdrawal rate in those early years. Is that something that's sustainable over time? I think it just warrants a little additional consideration. And so it's almost like a hindrance, if you will, to just say, or am I handcuffing myself by only adhering to a 4% withdrawal rate, in those early years of retirement. The last, I think, caveat or consideration to make in applying the 4% rule, especially for early retirees, is just factoring in front-loaded expenses that often come up during that kind of 5 to 10 year period before certain benefits kick in, i.e. Medicare, Social Security, things like that. Big one, I think, that commonly gets missed out on is healthcare costs for early retirees. If you are 55, you're not going to have Medicare kick in for 10 years. So the question I think that is important to answer in planning around that is, have I essentially planned for or adjusted budgeting or cash flow needs for that cost of healthcare, if you will? Premiums for a 55-year-old couple that's fairly healthy in the present day is probably around $25,000 a year. Again, it can vary widely based on whatever plan that you have. But regardless of the plan, it's going to be probably pretty expensive. And even once Medicare kicks in, typically for higher income earners or those who have built up significant nest eggs heading into retirement, Medicare is often not free, and it's probably not going to be free for you. The question that I think that needs to be answered or addressed is, as it pertains to portfolio withdrawals, do I have enough to cover that additional costs? If I really want to adhere to the 4% rule in those early years of retirement, is that being factored into meeting whatever that cost is? If I want to withdraw slightly more, am I planning around or incorporating that into my financial plan to make sure it's something that's sustainable over that long period of time? If I have a 40+ year period of retirement, is that being factored in? Are those higher costs being factored in? Taken in the kind of the aggregate, none of these is something that's going to make or break using the 4% rule. But I do think that just in general, the 4% rule can be a great place to start. But again, as I've kind of hopefully shown, it's just a good place for that, just starting, and typically warrants kind of additional analysis or consideration. So in watching this video so far, hopefully I've not put you off to planning and utilizing the 4% rule as a starting place to at least kind of begin thinking about retirement cash flows and really what might be sustainable over the long term. The answer of what might be a better fit or what might work better, the blanket statement I will say is formulating a financial plan can provide a lot of transparency into determining what is going to be a sustainable withdrawal amount from a portfolio based again on kind of the full picture of all of your financial assets. So if there's all these shortcomings or issues with the 4% rule, is it something we can actually rely on? I think the answer is probably it depends. While the 4% rule is not a bad thing per se, I do think that retirement planning in general warrants some additional kind of considerations. So if we ask the question, what are some of those considerations or things that we could do to potentially boost the probability of success for a retirement plan? First and foremost is probably just reducing withdrawal rates. If we look at our overall portfolio of assets, instead of a 4% withdrawal rate, maybe we start a calculation of a 3.5% rate or slightly below. If I have $1 million portfolio, maybe it's $35,000 in withdrawals in that first year, or $2 million, it's $70,000, for example. The trade-off, though, with using that or just reducing it is thinking, oh, well, I'm moving more conservative, so shouldn't that increase the probability of success in my plan? And the answer probably would be yes, but aren't you also simultaneously short-selling yourself or kind of shorting yourself a little bit in those early years of retirement? If a 5% withdrawal is actually sustainable or could be doable, but you're doing a 3.5% rate just on the idea that, well, it's more conservative than a 4%, isn't that kind of an unfortunate thing that you saved and planned for retirement all these years only to kind of live less of a life? Maybe you could have taken that big trip that you otherwise really wanted to do, but because it was above 4% of a withdrawal in a portfolio, we didn't do it. I hate to say it's kind of a sad thing. So on the surface, maybe a lower withdrawal rate, if that really makes you feel better, could be good. I think probably just more analysis is probably the better answer in general. A second kind of approach is what maybe we would call like a guardrail approach, where we would keep our withdrawal rate within a certain band of, let's say, 2.5% to 5% of the portfolio on any given year or in any given period of time. The challenge, though, as we alluded to previously, is that regardless of whatever that withdrawal rate is, if we get a huge down year or a down decade in the market, if we arrive at a certain value or a certain percentage withdrawal and suddenly our portfolio declines significantly, well, is that withdrawal rate going to be sustainable over time? So while kind of the guardrail approach is not a bad one per se, I think, again, just maybe some additional thought or analysis would go a long way. And that kind of leads us to our third approach. And one that's a good, I think, conversation starter for clients is what we call the bucket approach, where maybe we determine that we have a certain amount we spend each year or kind of on average each year. We hold maybe 1 to 2 years of that amount equivalent in cash or cash equivalents, especially if yields are decent. Above and beyond that, maybe we hold 3 to 5 years of equivalent expenses in a fairly conservative investment, maybe some sort of fixed income or what have you. And then above and beyond those years, whatever the balance left of the portfolio is, maybe we hold that in stocks or alternative investments or things that maybe you're going to be subject to a little more volatility, but we're really not going to need to touch it anytime soon. And as we hit a certain value, maybe we withdraw amounts from that to kind of trickle down, if you will, from equities, alternatives into fixed income generating income, and that then gets distributed or transferred into kind of your cash bucket, if you will. This can be further supplemented if you have things like real estate that are generating income, or a pension, or things like that where if we're spending $200,000 a year, for example, but we're getting $50,000 net in rental proceeds, well, then we're kind of filling that $150,000 gap using portfolio assets or eventually Social Security income. So it's flexible. It's not like set in stone, but I like that approach just because it gives us very delineated dollars that we might need to hold on to, regardless of kind of what market conditions look like. And I think kind of two final strategies or approaches to consider on top of kind of what else could I be thinking about on top of the 4% rule. The fourth strategy is kind of what we call like bridge employment, Maybe you are doing 1099 consulting income, even though you're retired. Maybe if you're a physician, you're doing Locum Tenens jobs or working part-time at a hospital. Maybe something that gives you benefits to where if you're retired at 55 years old, you're working 50% time at the hospital or for a practice, and you're paying for health insurance, or they're supplementing your health insurance. That can be certainly very impactful and offers some flexibility and still allowing you to travel, do a lot of the things that you might want to do, while also having that thing to fill time and almost kind of like serve as a transition into retirement and just figuring out, what am I going to do with 24 hours in a day now that I'm not having to work 60 hours plus a week. The final strategy I think to consider, and I actually think we see this more and more, is what we call geographic arbitrage, where if you live in a high cost of living area, you've saved up and have invested a sizable amount, instead of retiring in that area, or maybe where taxes might be higher in certain municipal areas, maybe moving to an area or even a country where taxes and just cost of living are lower in general. And certainly pros and cons for this, probably a whole other video we could cover on all the benefits, some of the drawbacks of doing that. But for example, if you have family that live in a certain area that's far away, that might be in a lower cost living area, that could certainly be a justification for taking that larger nest egg that you've built up and then moving to that area where if you were spending $200,000, $300,000 in New York or LA or something like that, where suddenly you can move somewhere and reduce your expenses by 25% each year. That's a sizable amount and is then trickled down to needing lesser withdrawals from your portfolios and by extension, increasing the likelihood of sustaining those portfolios over time. So all this to say that there are absolutely ways that you can work around the 4% rule, use it as kind of a starting place, especially if you're starting to think about early retirement or just retirement planning in general. One of the really great ways that we can start through this process is doing what we call like a stress test of a portfolio and really of a retirement plan in general. We do that by building out a financial plan. And within that plan are going to be things like calculating, well, what is a sustainable withdrawal rate for me, given my specific financial picture over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years plus. If estate planning, for example, is part of that, I want to leave $1 million to each of my children. Well, suddenly the 4% rule might not be a great fit for creating a retirement plan that adheres to that objective. So I think just figuring out what that retirement withdrawal rate is, that's a great place to kind of start or gauge. As part of that, running what we call a Monte Carlo simulation, where we are basically factoring in or plugging in kind of all the details of your financial picture, whether it's income, assets, liabilities, expenses, all that good stuff, running it through 1,000 different market outcomes, some of which are incredible markets over the next 30 years or 40 years, some of which are abysmal markets over the next 30 to 40 years, and saying, well, within those kind of outcomes, what kind of comfortability do I have with the odds or likelihood that my plan will be successful given those kind of various market outcomes? Number 3, approaching this with a little bit of flexibility in mind, that if we set a plan or create a plan that 5 years from now, we might need to adjust that plan. And it could be either way. If we enter a deep recession, maybe we need to change how much we're spending each month by some factor or amount. Maybe markets do incredibly and we can adjust the amount we're withdrawing. We could take that extra trip or buy that extra house that we've been looking at or condo, or take the kids to whatever vacation or thing that we had been thinking about. In tandem with that too is also just being flexible, but also having somewhat of an idea of a withdrawal strategy, specifically from a tax location perspective. If I have an IRA, a Roth IRA, a brokerage account, a 401k, a 403b, a 457b, the whole alphabet and number soup of various account types, or even real estate assets or alternative assets or a business that I own, how am I drawing funds or creating income for myself from all those various assets? And how am I doing that tax efficiently both today and over the course of my entire life? If I'm retiring in early years, are things like a Roth conversion going to make sense? If I'm selling my business, how do I go about approaching that from a tax perspective? So all of these kind of things, we call this tax location, and just in creating a tax efficient withdrawal strategy in retirement can actually boost the likelihood of a financial plan, of a retirement plan by a decent amount. Typically it's some kind of a rolling plan that we kind of adjust as needed, but one that we can formulate and factor in and say, okay, if this and this and this occurs, then over the next 25 to 30 years, here's kind of our tax plan, if you will, in creating tax efficient income in retirement. And then last, and number 5, last but certainly not least, is stress testing retirement withdrawals in those early years. If we get a huge bear market for the first 5 to 10 years of your retirement, is that going to jeopardize your retirement? I think it's kind of the short and sweet question of that. And there are ways to model that to where we can say, if I do experience a significant market correction in my portfolios, based on other factors or assets of my financial plan, that I'll be fine. Or, I need to save this much more to increase probability or likelihood that one instance like that is not going to hinder the success of my retirement plan over time. So a lot to factor in, a lot of things to consider, but a basic financial plan that's built for you should ideally eliminate or at least kind of touch on a lot of these various facets to make sure that you're covered, if you will, over time. We can't guarantee what the future will hold or what will bring. However, we can control what we can control. And if we think that it's going to boost the probability of our financial plan significantly to work 6 months or 2 years more, or even going part-time for 2 more years in working, or to sell certain assets, or to sell our business at certain time periods, we can control those things. And so making informed decisions on that based on the data that we have and what we believe is likely to occur certainly can go a long way in planning around the higher likelihood of success in retirement above and beyond just what is 4% of my IRA and then starting a plan off that. So parting thoughts, is the 4% rule a best fit or a great fit for everyone? Maybe, maybe not. I think if you're planning to retire earlier, that it's absolutely worth a little more thought and consideration than taking the value of your assets, multiplying that by 4%, and essentially arriving at a number that you believe could be sustainably withdrawn from those portfolios for the next 40, 50 years. There's just too many factors at play, and frankly, a little too much just to jeopardize purely on that approach. Having a financial plan can illuminate or provide a lot of peace of mind and honestly shed light and transparency on a lot of these types of considerations, especially as your net worth starts to creep up a little bit. You've got a little more complexity going on than the average Joe or Jane, and you're trying to factor and figure out and make all of these things work in tandem together, all these assets or income that you're generating. How do I make this work in tandem together or as part of a more cohesive financial plan that's aligned with your goals and objectives? I think having a plan like that in place heading into retirement and iterating on it as you are going through retirement can go a long way just in making sure that you're really achieving kind of the retirement that you want it to be, instead of having to worry about, oh gosh, I need to recalculate the 4% rule for this month to make sure I'm staying on track or tracking whatever inflation is this month, again, to kind of keep with that 4% rule. There's probably a better way than just that very simplistic approach. So is the 4% rule a lie? Probably not, but I do think it's a lie to outwardly say that it's a flat fit for every single person retiring, for applying it to any type of retirement, and saying that it's some sort of blanket rule that will work with universal applicability. I think that is a lie. And I do think that maybe the general public, when they hear 4% rule and maybe hear it explained, that the challenge is, it's like playing telephone, that game you played growing up. Someone tells it to you, you tell it to someone else, so on and so forth down the line, and the message gets a little convoluted or maybe not as clear on what exactly the rule is and how it should be applied. And I think that in tandem with that, retirement often just has a little more complexity than just what you could simply put on, a 2-sentence rule. All this to say that I think it's just a little more complexity, and a financial plan and retirement plan can candidly go a long way in providing transparency and a clear path forward to making sure that you are working towards and achieving the goals that you want to do, and making sure that your finances are aligned with and working in tandem with those goals and objectives. Again, I'm Scott Sturgeon, Senior Wealth Advisor and Financial Planner. We work primarily with physicians and business owners that are approaching retirement and wanting to align their finances with their goals and objectives in retirement to make sure that both are working in tandem to achieve those goals and objectives that they want. If any of this has piqued your interest or you're curious, in the link below, there's a description, a link to our firm, our website. We have a blog where we're constantly updating with various articles and topics, largely specific to physicians and business owners and planning around retirement. We also have our newsletter that we put out every 2 to 3 weeks. It covers a broad range of topics that are typically more timely, what's going on in markets, and ways to think about maybe the economy in general. And lastly, if you are very interested, consider scheduling a free assessment. It's a no obligation to you, typically 30 minutes, just to kind of get to know each other a little bit, learn what you're looking about in achieving from a financial planning perspective, and kind of where we can bring value potentially and working towards those aims and objectives. So thank you again so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day.